Welcome everyone to my last installment on assignment 7056, Writing About Writing 2. Okay, so as you can see, I'm looking at the assignment prompt inside of our BTW wiki, and I'm going to scroll down to tasks. Okay, so this video is about our third task, drafting a memo to our boss, relating the challenges of self-assessment and media to emails, memos, and letters. So at this point, you should have already drafted an executive summary of Lesson 8 in the form of a memo. You should have written a separate memo to your boss relating how you could apply Lesson 8 to your writing in Assignment 7063. And now we are drafting a third memo in which you talk about these challenges and how they relate to emails, memos, and letters. So this memo that we're working on right now is kind of an extension of one that we created for assignment 7063 on emails, memos, and letters. So it's just kind of an expansion on the discussion of when we write these particular documents, what goes into that writing process. Okay, so to figure out what I'm writing, I need to first figure out what the challenges of self-assessment and media are. So I'm going to start with self-assessment. So if you click on this link right here, this is the page that will pop up. And so I'm going to spend some time reading this page, and what I will find out is that the challenge of self-assessment is really about being able to create a writing process that allows us to identify content that we know that will be useful for what I'm writing, and identifying things that I don't know yet. And that then gives me an opportunity to go through a process of finding out that information that I need so that I can include it. So basically, the overcoming the challenge of self-assessment, it recommends that you start with a free write. And free writes are really helpful because there's no restrictions on it. You just start writing on a topic. Let's say you're asking for a promotion and you're not sure what you need to include in your request. And so I might just start with a free write about why I deserve this promotion, what I think goes into the promotion, what the job is about, and that sort of thing, and just kind of let my thoughts flow. And once I'm finished kind of free writing everything out, then I can look at what I've written to identify what I know and what I need to find out. Maybe the free write points out to me things I didn't realize I understood, and that just kind of came out during my writing. And then identifying things that are missing that I think will be important for my my request, but I don't know what that content is yet. So maybe I don't know exactly what the criteria is for that promotion. And so that identifies content that I already know that I can use in my request and content that I need to go find. And then I'm able to sketch out a plan of what my document would look like, or what my process would be for finding all the content I need. And then I can create an outline of my arguments. So that's basically the challenge of self-assessment. The idea is that we don't always know or realize what we know. And we don't always know all of the content that we need in order to accomplish a project. So it's all about creating a writing process that allows us to identify the information that we know that is useful, identify the information that we need to go find, and then create a plan for doing that. And as a result of executing that plan, jotting down an outline of our content and our arguments. Okay, so that's the challenge of self-assessment. So once I understand that term, I'm going to come back here and reread what it's asking me to say. Okay, so it wants me to talk about the relevance of self-assessment to writing emails, memos, and letters. Okay, so this is basically asking me to talk about my writing process, but specifically my writing process in terms of discovering information or content that I will need to include. So this is my outline for my memo. Okay, so you can see that I've got the memo format up. I've got my RE or subject line here, and you can clearly see that it is a unique title to this particular document. I'm going to wait to write my opening until I've written the rest of it because I think that it's much easier to set up the context of content after I've already written that content. It's really hard to explain or introduce something that hasn't been written yet. So even though the opening comes first, I'm going to draft it last. So I'm going to focus first on my first body paragraph. So this assignment is pretty simple in terms of structuring my body. There's two topics, so I will have two body paragraphs, one on self-assessment and one on the challenge of media, which I'll talk about in a minute. Okay, so first I need to figure out what I want to say about this. And so our PEC order, or premise, evidence, and conclusion paragraph structure can help me with this. So I need to first come up with a premise. And so a premise is simply an I think statement, but another way to think of a premise is an answer to a question. So I, if I'm trying to write on something that seems kind of complex and I feel like this discussion is a little complex, I might first sketch out what the question is. How does the challenge of self-assessment relate to my creating emails, letters, and memos? And now I know that I'm interpreting the challenge of self-assessment as a writing process that allows me to identify content I already possess and content I need to go find. Okay, so once I have an idea of that, I know that, so from previous assignments and also from materials that I've found on Moodle and the wiki about emails, letters versus memos, that these kinds of communication call for different content to a certain extent. So I might answer that this matters, the self-assessment challenge matters to these different genres because each genre calls for slightly different content, even in just its design. Therefore, my process for overcoming the self-assessment challenge may look different depending on the genre I'm writing. Okay, so that's a pretty big claim, and so I would then have to break that down. So that was our premise, and then so this would be my first sentence of this paragraph, and then the next, I don't know, 6 to 7 sentences, something like that, would be my evidence. And so I would need to prove each part of my premise. First, that genres call for slightly different content, even in its design. So I might break this up into two kinds of evidence. First, I want to prove that these three genres call for slightly different content. And two, how the design calls for different content. Okay, so I'll need to prove those two things in my evidence. Let's see if there's anything else in my premise I need to prove. Therefore, my process for overcoming the self-assessment challenge may look differently. Okay, so then I would need to take these examples of different content, show how examples of different content for different genres would require different processes for discovering what I know, don't know. Okay. And so as I'm writing this evidence, I might find that I don't completely agree with my premise, that sometimes there will be differences, but also there will be things that I always want to do, like free writing to find out what I want to know. And so I might revise my premise to be more exact to what I actually believe. So I might say early steps in overcoming the self-assessment challenge can look very much the same between genres. However, once I start tailoring that content to the genre, then I may need to find information in my self-assessment process that wouldn't be required when using another genre. So for example, letters require that you know your recipient's address block. And so in my process, I would not know that um, just off of the top of my head. So in my self-assessment process, I would identify that as something I didn't know, and then I would include in my process steps going and finding that address and then outlining it. And so that would be something I wouldn't do in an email, and that's something I wouldn't do in a memo. And so that particular item changes my process. However, reflection or free writing may be the same throughout. Okay, so that's basically what you can do to draft this body paragraph. You can start with a premise, start writing your evidence, and then as you find that you're kind of leading towards different ideas, revise your premise to make it match better. Alternatively, you could just write the evidence first. And then once you've identified what you think, how self-assessment applies to each of these genres, then you can draft your premise and put that up front. And then finally, in our PEC order, is the concluding thought. So this would be the last sentence or two of your paragraph in which you answer the question, so what? Why does this matter? And so again, if you remember from our earlier videos, a concluding thought or a conclusion basically connects the idea of that paragraph to the overall purpose of a document. And so then I have to think about what is the overall purpose of this document. And I think it's pretty clear that what it's trying to get me to do is have a better idea of how to write these genres. So if this is all about me and or giving advice or discovering advice on how to write emails, memos, and letters, I would answer the question of so what, why does this matter, with this matters because each genre calls for a slightly different writing process, depending on the information one needs to discover. Okay, and so that answers the question why this matters. Why this matters to you, why this matters to other writers, why this should matter to Alex, the person you're writing this to. Okay, so that's an example of drafting your first body paragraph. And once you feel that your body paragraph looks pretty solid, you can move on to doing the same thing for the challenge of media. So I'm not going to spend as much time on this one since I showed you an example of how to draft a paragraph already. So I am going to open up our wiki page on the challenge of media, and then I would want to read this page. And basically what this is telling me is that each of our genres are delivered in a different way. And so the challenge of media is all about how do you want to deliver your content, your request? How do you want your reader to be able to interact with it? Do you want them to be able to just pull it up at any time? And how would, or do you want them to be able to read it when they don't have a computer, or do you want them to be able to copy and paste from it? And then retrieval is all about how do you want people to be able to re-access it. So would you want to be able to access it from any computer? Would you not want that? There may be reasons for security that you don't want to have an electronic version of something. So this is the question of what media or in what form or in what medium do you deliver your content? So do you decide to write it in an email, or do you decide to write it in a hard copy memo, or do you decide to write it in a letter that could or could not be electronic? And do you attach the memo to an email, and so on and so forth? And so the question is, when you're deciding whether or not you make your document a hard copy or electronic copy or a PDF or a Word document, you want to think about how do you want to deliver this to your audience? How do you want them to be able to interact with it? Do you want them to be able to copy and paste it? Do you want them to be able to change it? Or do you want to make sure that it never, like, they wouldn't be able to change it and then claim that it said something different than what you actually wrote? And then how would you want people to be able to retrieve it or find it again? Okay, and so once I understand the challenge of media, I'm going to come back to my draft. Oh, here we go. And so again, kind of outline my paragraph, maybe starting with the question. Why does the challenge of media matter to creating email, letters, and memos? And so my answer would address that question, and that would be my premise, the first sentence of my body paragraph. And so I would relate what I've interpreted the challenge of media to for why it matters for drafting this. And I think it clearly means that the challenge of media matters because then it tells us in what genre we want to write, perhaps, but also perhaps in what form we want to deliver our document. So an email will always be electronic, but letters and memos could be electronic as well as hard copy. So the challenge of media asks us the question of how do we want to deliver our message to our audience? How do we want them to be able to access it? And what do we want them to be able to do with it? And so then I would spend my paragraph talking about those different uses and why I would or would not. And then draw it to a close, have your concluding thought. So the last sentence of this paragraph on media, answering the question, so what? Why does that matter? Okay. All right. So that's the bulk of this memo. Once you've drafted your body paragraphs, then you can come back up and write your opening and basically present what these two things have to do with one another. So establish context. What will this memo discuss? And so you can think of this as a thesis, an overall premise about both topics. And then come to our closing. So just like the concluding sentence of each paragraph relates that content to the overall purpose, so too does a closing or concluding paragraph. So the closing paragraph would then basically take each of your concluding thoughts from each body paragraph and put them together. So remember that this is where we resolve conflicting ideas. So how do we make these two concluding thoughts, why the challenge of media and why the challenge of self-assessment matter, together? And that is a question I don't think you can answer until you have identified your concluding thoughts about each of these individual points. Okay, so this, your closing paragraph doesn't have to be very long, just a couple of sentences, but I'll be interested to see what kind of interesting conclusions you come to in your analysis of these two topics and how you make sense of them together and how they affect the writing of emails, letters, and memos together. Okay, so once you're done writing that memo, you should be pretty much done with this assignment. So you'll have your 3 memos, and then make sure you put a title page on it. So instead of putting a bird on it, put a title page on it. Save it in one Word document. Come back to our BTW wiki. Find the place where you will submit Writing About Writing 2. It's over here. It's also under week 2. So here is Writing About Writing 2. Click on that. Make sure you save your document in one Word document. Click Add Submission. Then you will either drag and drop your single file in here, or you can click this button here to add a file. So there should only be one Word document with your 3 memos and title page in it. And make sure you click Save Changes, or else it will not be sent to me for grading. All right, I hope you found this video helpful, and if so, that you'll check out my other ones, and good luck.